Hey everyone, it's Franchise Horror Reviews, and I hope everybody's having a great day so far today. Today I want to discuss the next review in this Creepshow series of reviews I will be doing. And I even have a discussion video I decided to plan kind of in conjunction with these because I find it fascinating. And we're going to be discussing Creepshow 2 today. Now, this film came out in 1987. And it was originally intended to be released earlier. There was a script that Stephen King had wrote around 1984 that involved 4 stories, and I'll get into that in just a minute, and a wraparound interluding story with the kid character from the first movie to kind of act like the 5th story. And this was supposed to be a different setup to the original, still homaging that comic book flair the original had and the love of EC Comics. And the intention was to have George Romero still come back and direct it. And George Romero, within this first draft of this original script, adapted the stories that Stephen King put forth for the comic segments and the interluding story involving the boy character. Well, it took a few years, and by that time Stephen King decided to step away from the project in terms of creative. He wanted to do other things. His career had taken off in the mid-'80s. He was busy with bigger things. But you do see him featured in this movie because this is one of the things he created. This is one of his babies, right? So he is featured as an actor in one of the segments here. And George Romero decided not to direct the film, I guess for reasons of his own. And they brought in a guy named Michael Gornick to direct this film. Now, the troubled production behind this movie, right, and I think they might mention it in this little Arrow video. I have 2 copies here. One copy I've had since I was a kid, and this copy I recently bought for my collection. I think they might mention some of the production issues they have with this film in this Arrow video with the special edition content in it. But nonetheless, the original idea was supposed to have 4 stories. In the 4 stories, they were done by Stephen King beforehand, or they were written specifically for the movie in mind. The 4 stories were going to be the story called Old Chief Woodenhead, which had been scrapped by King because he couldn't figure out a way to finish it. But when this idea for a sequel to Creepshow came around, he decided to repurpose that story and give the film rights over to the production company involved with making these Creepshow films. And then the second story he intended was called Pinfall, which he drafted and wrote the concept for, and George Romero took it and adapted it to screenplay. And that story would end up getting canceled out of this movie in the final version. And then the third story was The Raft, which made it into the final version like Old Chief Woodenhead. And this was a previously published short story that King had already put out there into the ether. And the fourth one was called The Cat from Hell, which was also another short story King had put out into the ether beforehand. And The Cat from Hell ended up getting scrapped from this film, but later on would appear in a movie called Tales from the Dark Side, the movie. So what happened? What happened to this original idea? Well, when it came down to the production of the film, when the studio finally greenlit the idea, they went down to redraft the movie. They wanted to keep the interluding story with the kid and keep King's vision. And they were going to go this animated route with it to kind of give it a more, throwback to 50s horror in a different way than the original film. They wanted to go to animation, have an animated creep. They wanted to have the story kind of wrap around together more so than the first film did. And they pretty much greenlit the animation into production immediately, from what I gather. Now, to my knowledge, they wanted a 5th story. And since King had kind of backed away from the project creatively and didn't want to change his vision on it, and Romero didn't really see the novelty in creating a new story from scratch, the production company ran by Richard P. Rubenstein, who plays an important role moving forward for these next couple of reviews, took the liberty and bought the film rights for a short story written by Lucille Fletcher called The Hitchhiker. and wanted to add that on as a fifth story to the film. Now, when it came down to the brass tacks of money, they couldn't adapt all of them. So they had to pick two stories to scrap. Now, since they went out of their way with Lucille Fletcher, they decided to keep that one. And they essentially had to axe two of the Stephen King stories. And they chose to axe Pinfall, which was the original one he wrote for this movie, and Cat from Hell, which was, like I said, the story he wrote before that he gave the film rights for, to the studio to make it into a movie. And they put those aside and were planning on saving them for potentially another Creepshow installment that never happened. So that production guy, Richard P. Rubenstein, held on to the rights of these stories, and when he got hired on later with Paramount to do Tales from the Dark Side, the movie, he had the rights to these stories still, and he decided to take the liberty and put one of them into the movie, which was Cat from Hell, and he had a second one called Pinfall that he wanted to set aside for the sequel to that movie that never got made. And that's a whole other topic for another day. And I'll probably talk about that unmade Tales from the Dark Side sequel, because it is, in spirit, just like the Tales from the Dark Side movie, the unofficial successors to these Creepshow films. So what ended up remaining was the animated segment dealing with the boy character and the animation involved, and then they kept Old Chief Woodenhead, the Raft, and the Hitchhiker. And that's essentially what this movie is. Now, I think that this movie is a great follow-up to the original. I think it takes a whole different approach on how to honor atomic age horror. And I think it's in some ways more immersive than the first film, but I still think that level of awareness that King and Romero had in terms of laying out the story and how the effects were going to be done, and I think the effects crew there, Tom Savini, he comes back in this movie, and you even see some people pop up like Greg Nicotero and Howard Berger, who helped out with Tom Savini in this. And Greg Nicotero went on to have a hell of a career in his life. And this is probably one of his earlier works that you can, see on film. So there's a lot going for this movie. But in a whole, I think it kind of lacks that charm and that love letter feel that the first film had. It tries to emulate it, but it just doesn't quite get there. And I'll get to that near the end of the video. But Creepshow 2 is still a fantastic follow-up to the original in a lot of its own ways. So the story essentially follows presumably the same kid from the original Creepshow. And this time he's out riding his bike. He wants to go to the comic stand. Back in the day, you had to go to a newsstand to get comics. And he wants to go to his local newsstand to pick up the latest issue of Creepshow. And there's a truck delivering these comics, and there's a guy on the truck that looks like the Creep. And the guy underneath the Creep makeup is actually Tom Savini himself, which is really cool. And they drop off the latest issue of Creepshow, and he goes to pick up his issue, and he can't wait to read it. Well, it kicks on into an animated segment, and the animation looks kind of decent, but the problem is some of the characters look really off. Like the Creep, when you see this depiction of the Creep in animation, he looks like he has a dick and balls as a face, kind of reminiscent to the grandpa from Hey Arnold. It's really bad looking. And the Creep is he has like a little dungeon, and he's talking about, scaring people, and it kind of goes into the more schlocky kids route. Similar to how Tales from the Crypt Keeper, the cartoon that would come out soon after this, would approach it. But how you go into the stories of the comic issue is through the animation. And you see the kid, he's, riding his bike, and he has to encounter some neighborhood bullies. And through that comes in the first story when it opens up, and it's called Old Chief Woodenhead. Now, these stories are very easy to spoil, so I'm only going to run them over very surface level. So essentially, in this story, there's a couple that live out west, and they moved out west years ago in the prosperity and hopes that moving out there would bring them more population. You know, it's implied that they moved out there before the state they live in became a state and it was more of a territory. And when they moved out there, there seemed to be promise. People were moving and it seemed like jobs were coming over. But over time, as they lived there for many, many, many years, jobs have closed down, people have moved away. And now they run this little store in a ghost town, essentially. And they have this statue that was given to them by this nearby Native American tribe out front called Chief Woodenhead, which is a symbol of thanks for things that they have done for them since they moved here to the town. And there's a trade of goods. You know, traditionally and historically, Native Americans have bartered with, you know, general stores, you know, owned by, you know, Americans, and have done collateral deals. And it's pretty accurate on that regard. And the chief of the tribe has made a collateral deal, and he's come to pay the debt he owes. And he wants to give him this really beautiful jewelry owned by his tribe that are worth a lot of money. And he says, hey, look, it might exceed the value of what we owe you, but this is sheer gratitude. And the old couple doesn't want to take it from him, but they reluctantly take it and decide, you know what, maybe by the money they make off here, maybe it's about time they sell the shop and just move on and go retire somewhere. And they're open to that idea. Well, unfortunately for them, that night, when they received this jewelry, a band of thugs, led by a guy who's a part of this tribe, and he's dishonoring his tribe by doing this, has taken a few of his friends of the nearby town that he's made to go on a joyride robbing spree, and wants to go rob the general store to take money from them and valuables, as he knows about the jewelry, to head to Hollywood so he can have a film career. And essentially when they get there, there's a whole drawn out thing with them talking about their motives and wanting to go to Hollywood and make something of their lives, and how they want pretty much anything valuable within the store. And the old couple tries to oblige, but something happens, and let's just say these robbers do something pretty terrible. Now, after the robbers leave the scene, the statue out front, Chief Woodenhead, may or may not come to life. And for the rest of the story, it has this slasher ambiance to it, where there might be some vengeance involved for what was done. And the end of the story kind of symbolizes that. And that's essentially Old Chief Woodenhead. This one has a story. If there's any deep meaning about this, right? It's about the things of vanity, right? How vanity, it's kind of similar to the story Father's Day in the first movie, but kind of different. These thugs kind of represent vanity and chasing fame and the cost of fame, right? And that seems to be the underlying theme to this story. And you know, for the elderly couple, it's about you know, making decisions to better your life, and you don't really get that out of your life, and how it's sometimes too late, or maybe even never too late, to, you know, get out of a situation that you're just not happy with. And yeah, that's basically all the story offers. But it did what it did pretty good. The second story is called The Raft. Now, this one's my personal favorite in this movie, and it probably has the least amount of substance to it, or least amount of commentary to it. Traditionally, these Creepshow stories have this undercurrent of, I don't know, you know, social commentary or some thought-provoking topics. This one really doesn't, and if I had to put my finger on what it's trying to commentate on, if it is at all, is the recklessness of adolescence. And it just talks about that with these kids, these four kids. They're, you know, up in age, teenagers, maybe in high school, maybe in college, and they just want to get away one day. It's a nice day, and they head to the lake in their nearby town. And they head up to the lake. and they park their car, and they want to go swimming out in the lake, and they're having fun, being teenagers, and they discover this raft, and they think it would be fun to go stand on the raft, kind of like, daring each other, hey, let's go stand on this raft and see how long we could stand on here, stuff like that. And while they're on the raft, the water around them seems to have this thing moving around. Looks like an oil slick. And one of the girls observes the oil slick and touches it while she's smoking a cigarette. And the oil slick may or may not be a monster. And something happens to this girl. And the other three are awestruck what happens to her. And it's pretty grisly and gory what happens to her. And the other three realize that they're trapped on this raft. And the rest of the story essentially plays out by laying out one by one how these kids interact with this oil slick in the water. And eventually, after watching some grueling stuff happen with some crazy gore and violence, there's one remaining. And do they make it out alive? You have to see it for yourself. Yeah, The Raft is a very simple story, but I think what it was going for is a visual type of storytelling and just for shock value. I think this is easily, so far in the Creepshow franchise, the story that's played most on shock value and the unknown, not really trying to commentate on anything. But I have a little bit I want to say near the end of the video for this. So, yeah, this one was pretty solid for what it was. And then the last story is called The Hitchhiker. And The Hitchhiker is a story essentially about this woman who has an affair with a man. Kind of similar to Something to Tide You Over from the original movie, right? But it told it in a different way. So this woman's having an affair with this man. And she's been doing this for a while. And she realizes the time, it's getting late. And she needs to get home before her husband gets home from work. So she heads out. It's cold outside. It's icy on the roads. She's driving on this back road type of thing where her lover lives in this back road area, kind of mountainy. And she lives in more of the suburban part of the area. She heads in her car and she's driving. And she gets distracted. She's a smoker and she's listening to the radio and she has all these distractions going on, and she sees a hitchhiker in the corner of her eye, but doesn't really pay attention to it. But when she realizes that she's taken her eyes off the road too long and she's headed straight for the hitchhiker, it's too late. She tries to slam on brakes, but since it's icy, her car kind of still creams into him and hits the hitchhiker, and the hitchhiker pretty much falls, presumably dead. And she stops the car and frantically is like, well, if I try to get help, I'm going to be late getting home to my husband. Then I have to say, hey, I was helping this hitchhiker that I accidentally hit with my car. And the husband would be like, well, why were you in this area? You never go there. And then that would cause suspicion for him to, look into her. And she feels like her husband would be too suspicious of her if she tries to help. And since she's only thinking about herself, she drives off and leaves the hitchhiker for dead. Now, in this story, Stephen King himself makes a cameo in here as a truck driver passing by, looking at the scene. Like, obviously there was a crash there, and there's a lot of fun to be had with that. He's over the top acting like he was in the Jordy Verrill story in the first movie, which is always fun. But as this woman is driving home, as she's continuing the drive, she starts to have visions, or she thinks she's having visions about this hitchhiker keeps appearing on the route home. And something may or may not come from this. And over the night, the hitchhiker keeps making his appearance known, and there comes a situation where she has to pretty much deal with this head on. She can't just run from this problem. And she realizes that if she doesn't do it, she might as well be dead anyway, from her husband or from this thing that might be following her. And the climax of the story happens where there may or may not be some type of resolution to the situation, as you think. But Later on, there's an ending that involves her later back at home, and something may not have been what it seemed like during the climax, and there's a grisly discovery. And let's just put it that way. And that is the hitchhiker. Now, I've kind of skipped the interluding parts from the boy in this movie, but where we left off last, before these stories started to kick on, the boy's running from these bullies. And throughout these interluding segments, he ends up in a lot, right? He has this, he has been running from his bullies for a while, and he has this Creepshow comic, and it's talking about Venus flytraps, all right? And this is kind of like a cool thing you can purchase from the comic. And he may or may not have already, had them or something. It's kind of vague, but they end up in this lot, him and his bullies. And these Venus flytraps from the comic are actually there and essentially eat his bullies alive, right? And the end of the story kind of wraps up with him, leaving the situation, and he's kind of grinning. And there's a nod to the first movie where he's, stabbing the neck of his father with a voodoo doll on the cover of the comic. And that's kind of throughout the story as well. And the ending ends off with Tom Savini playing the creep, waving goodbye and bidding bon voyage in the truck that has all the issues of Creepshow comics. And that's essentially Creepshow 2. So yeah, this movie I think is an inherent downgrade. I don't know why this just dropped, but this movie is an inherent downgrade from the original film, in my opinion. I do think it has some heart and soul to it. I think they did what they could here, given the budget constraints. They tried to go over the top with the kid interluding in the story, and I think King's initial vision with that was to have his son come back and reprise his role and give him a more expansive role in the movie. Maybe even a voice role or something, I don't know. And the whole four-story format was supposed to be interlocking with that, his original idea. And I think when they finally greenlit this movie, I think the interluding story kind of makes it stand out from the original, but I don't think it really does anything all that special with it. They go similar animation style that was used in the first film for some segments of the Creep. But the look of the Creep here looks terrible. I'm not even going to lie. It looks bad in the animation. He looks like he has a dick and balls on his face. And he goes around throughout the story, this animation bit, and it's just, he looks terrible, and it's just hard for me to like this little Creep rendition here. If you look at the cover of this Blu-ray here by Arrow Video, you can kind of get a glimpse of the difference of the Creep look from the original movie. And I don't like the style choice they went here. I kind of wish they kept this look from the first film, in my personal opinion, but it is what it is. But the way the movie wrapped up was still kind of cool, and it's still a love letter to comic fans of yesteryear, especially during the Atomic Age and Silver Age, and even early Bronze Age comics, when they had to go to newsstands. This was before comic shops existed. So it has that comic book atmosphere, and it still has those comic book transitions the first film had. Now, these three stories, I don't think have quite the level of substance here. I think my personal favorite is The Raft, and it arguably has the least amount of substance. But it essentially is telling a story about peer pressure in some ways. It's kind of like if you imagine yourself on a bridge with your friends, and there's no way for you to get off the bridge. The only way off is to jump down 10 stories to the water below. And when you come to that realization, you have to either decide to wait your friends out and watch them do it, and then try to find a way out, or simply follow suit and just succumb to the same fate they're going to succumb to. And while it's not really trying to be deep in the story, it is effective with its visuals, and it's super memorable. And I can understand if people think that this is the best story in the Creepshow franchise, but I don't think it quite gets to the level of The Crate or another story we see later on in Tales from the Dark Side. So I'd probably give the story about a 4.5 out of 5. It's just lacking that substance I want out of a Creepshow story. And my second favorite would probably be the Hitchhiker, which I think I gave this one about a 3.5 out of 5. It's a severe downgrade. You know, these next two are by far not as good, in my opinion, as the weakest one from the original Creepshow, which was Father's Day, in my opinion. But this one is still effective, and it's talking about adultery and kind of hiding truths, and it's essentially saying that you can't really hide things. I mean, everything you try to hide eventually comes out and comes to haunt you. And that's what this story is talking about. And I think it's effective for what it is. I just don't think it really goes to levels that other stories have gone. The Hitchhiker looks really good. The gore effects on him look fantastic. But it just feels kind of, I don't know, unremarkable compared to some other films, other stories in these films that just have that flair from Tom Savini. And I'm not trying to knock the people who did the effects or anything in this film. They did a fantastic job for what they were given budget-wise. But I just think that they didn't understand the genius that made the first film what it was. You know, with that red and blue hint of lighting to accentuate comic panels. That's how they had to do comics back in the day. There was a level of awareness and smartness, and they didn't try to capitalize that same awareness here. And I feel like if they did, maybe some of these stories could have been elevated for me. But yeah, The Hitchhiker is my second favorite. And my least favorite, now this one, it's still an emotional story, but I think this one just kind of drags a little bit. And this is Old Chief Woodenhead is my least favorite. It does have a good moral message to the end, and it has that vengeance tone. You know, there's two sides you can kind of dissect with the old couple about, you know, making decisions and kind of living with regrets with your decisions in life, and maybe it could be too late for you to change, or maybe it's never too late to change. And it's kind of a tragic story because the moment they decide to make a change in their life, they essentially get that taken away from them. And you look at the trio of thugs who are, you know, symbolizing vanity and chasing fame and the cost of fame. That's prevalent here too, right? And I feel like the story, while it hits the emotional notes that these stories are known for, it just doesn't wow me with anything. I think what could have improved it is in the final section with Chief Woodenhead. If that was done a little bit better and not kind of rushed through, and some of the gore that was implied to be in the story was actually shown for some reason. The gore in this segment was taken out of it, and a lot of the stuff was done off screen. And I think that's because they wanted to keep the effects in the raft to make that story pop a little more, because they realized it lacked story substance. And also to avoid an X rating from the MPAA. But still, I feel like this is the most sanitized story in the whole bunch. So I gave this about a 3.5 out of 5 as well. So all in all, I think Creepshow 2 is an evident downgrade, but not a terrible movie at all. Far from it. I mean, this is still a great movie. I just prefer the original. I think the original is much smarter. I think it has more of a love letter feel to it. And I think it was better made than this. But this does have its things that are not in the first movie that I kind of wish were. Like the interluding story is a great concept and great idea. The animation, though, it's hit or miss. Especially with the creep looking like he has a dick and balls for a face. I can pass on that. I like this look better. And yeah, I like having, you know, the creep kind of making like a meta appearance throughout the story. That's cool too. But all in all, I'd probably give this film, with its issues and nothing really perfect in here in terms of the stories they chose to adapt, I'd give this about a 4 out of 5 stars. It's a high recommend from me. So let me know down in the comment section down below. Have you seen this movie before? Do you love this? Do you hate this? What's your favorite story in this? What's your least favorite? I'm dying to know. And I'll see you next time.